A recent report from the Wall Street Journal posits that a great deal of our modern interest in the possibility of alien spacecraft reaching Earth may have actually been manufactured by the US military through a combination of concerted disinformation campaigns, hazing rituals run amok, and a recent cover-up meant to hide this reality from the public. But while this report has garnered a great deal of interest and outrage from the UFO community online, it was a different part of the journal's investigation that caught my attention. The claim that in 1967 the United States was testing an EMP weapon, or electromagnetic pulse generator, on its own nuclear ICBM silos, without ever even mentioning it to the airmen manning or guarding those facilities, some of whom even reportedly took aim at this experimental weapon with their rifles during the test, assuming it to be some sort of alien spacecraft. Now that is a pretty significant claim, and to be honest, it's one that's left me pretty skeptical. In fact, I wrote and recorded an entire script about this alleged EMP weapon that I intended to post last Friday. That is, until I got my hands on some of the same piles of documents that informed the journal's report. And what I found really surprised me. So let's dive into the highly classified world of American EMP weapons and the secretive efforts to protect America's nuclear arsenal from them. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is a special edition of Air Power. The Supermarine Spitfire is one of my favorite World War II aircraft, in no small part because of the insane heroism of the pilots who flew it. During the Battle of Britain, pilots saw as little as just 9 hours of formal flight training before being sent up into combat, often flying multiple sorties a day while outnumbered and outgunned, all just to beat back the seemingly endless swarm of German fighters and bombers. And not all of these incredible aviators were Brits, like Australian ace Patterson Clarence Hughes, who scored 17 air-to-air victories before being shot down over the UK, and Spitfire number X4009. But why am I telling you that? Well, because now is your chance to own a piece of aviation history with Rec Watch's X4009 series of timepieces. You see, an Australian nonprofit called the Hunter Fighter Collection is actively restoring the recovered wreckage of this aircraft, and that means replacing some of the original damaged aluminum. So, Rec Watches partnered with them to reforge that Spitfire aluminum into the 6 o'clock subdial for every watch in their X4009 line, meaning every watch includes real aluminum from this aircraft that fought in the Battle of Britain. And because a portion of every watch sold is going back to the Hunter Fighter Collection to restore this aircraft, it means you're not just buying a piece of history, you're very literally helping to keep that history alive. Now, each X4009 timepiece is certified Swiss-made and crafted with uncompromising attention to detail, and the design pays tribute to World War II pilot watches with key features like a ribbon spar crown guard inspired by aircraft construction and an X4009 Spitfire silhouette engraved on the rotor. Now, there's obviously only a limited number of these watches that can be made, and if you want to get your own, I can get you 10% off by using my promo code SAND. And I want to be clear that I'm not just acting excited for the ad read. I've actually already pre-ordered a Habu timepiece from Rec Watches for myself. So go to recwatches.com or just follow the link in the description below to buy your X4009 Spitfire timepiece today. And don't forget to use that SAND promo code when you do. 2 weeks ago, a report by Joel Schechtman and Aruna Viswanathan was published by the Wall Street Journal entitled "The Pentagon Disinformation That Fueled America's UFO Mythology." Now, this report, the authors claim, summarizes the findings of their team after conducting interviews with 24 current and former U.S. officials, scientists, and military contractors involved in the Pentagon's unidentified aerial phenomena, or UAP, investigations, as well as thousands of pages of documents, transcripts, recordings, emails, and text messages. Now, a handful of these sources, like the 84-year-old Robert Salas, are named, but the vast majority are not, and therein really lies the basis for most of the criticism of this piece. While it does purport to explain away decades worth of pop culture UFO fever as the product of a combination of half-baked semi-official efforts to keep stealth jets a secret, it offers very little in the way of concrete substantiation for those claims. But it is worth noting that my understanding is that this was just the first article in what may well be a series, and that means more evidence and details may still be forthcoming. Now, UFO Twitter quickly went after the journal's claims that an Air Force officer would drop off doctored photos of flying saucers to a bar near Area 51 to sway the public toward believing Uncle Sam was testing anti-gravity spaceships rather than the F-117 Nighthawk, as well as claims that classified briefings about the recovery of crashed alien spacecraft reportedly went on for decades as a result of a hazing ritual that took on a life of its own. But to be totally honest with you, I do find these stories to be pretty feasible. It is an objective fact that the Pentagon keeps secrets, and keeps them pretty well. I mean, here we are, some 14 years since the Bin Laden raid, and we have still yet to see even a single clear photograph of the stealth helicopters that were used, including one that was lost, in that operation. We know for a fact that the US Air Force has been flying technology demonstrators for its next stealth fighter for at least 6 years now. But to date, we still don't even really know what the F-47 that this program produced will actually look like. Heck, in 2002, Boeing revealed the truly alien-looking YF-118G bird of prey that they secretly built and tested entirely within the confines of Area 51, and that the world would never have known about had they not opted to give it a post-retirement PR party. Secrets and defense go hand in hand, and nowhere is that more prevalent than on the bleeding edge of emerging technologies that promise to have a massive strategic impact on the battlefield. And when I say strategic, I mean technology that could not just help fight a war, but that could theoretically help to end one. Technologies like quantum computing and artificial intelligence today, like stealth aircraft in the 80s and 90s, and certainly like the destructive capacity of electromagnetic pulses in the 1960s and 70s. Which brings us to the topic that caught my attention in this article. According to the journal, Sean Kirkpatrick, the former head of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or AARO, investigated several reports of nuclear weapons silos and launch control facilities seemingly being shut down by unidentified glowing objects floating in the airspace above them all throughout the 60s and 70s. Now, one of these reports came from March 24th of 1967, and a former Air Force captain named Robert Salas, who was interviewed by AARO as well as by the Wall Street Journal for their piece. And I'll quote the journal's report now. Quote, "He was prepared to launch apocalyptic strikes should Soviet Russia ever attack first, and got a call around 8 p.m. one night from a guard station above. A glowing reddish-orange oval was hovering over the front gate," Salas told Kirkpatrick's investigators. The guards had their rifles drawn, pointed at the oval object, appearing to float above the gate. A horn sounded in the bunker, signaling a problem with the control system. All 10 missiles were disabled. Now, the report goes on to say that Salas soon learned of similar incidents at other silos, and that Kirkpatrick and his team interviewed 5 witnesses of similar events that again took place throughout the 60s and 70s. And then it offers AARO's reported explanation for these events. The secret testing of an electromagnetic pulse generator that was meant to simulate the effects that a nuclear blast might have on the facility's electronics. I'll quote Shechtman and Viswanathan's coverage again. Quote, "To test this vulnerability, the Air Force developed an exotic electromagnetic generator that simulated this pulse of disruptive energy without the need to detonate a nuclear weapon. When activated, this device placed on a portable platform 60 feet above the facility would gather power until it glowed, sometimes with a blinding orange light. It would then fire a burst of energy that could resemble lightning. The electromagnetic pulses snaked down cables connected to the bunker where launch commanders like Salas sat, disrupting the guidance systems, disabling the weapons, and haunting the men to this day. And they weren't wrong about haunting the men. Salas still fervently believes it was aliens that shut his facility down, now 58 years ago. Now, electromagnetic pulses, or EMPs, really earned their spot on Uncle Sam's list of stuff he's worried about in July of 1962, when a high-altitude 1.4 megaton nuclear test detonation out over the middle of the Pacific Ocean produced a powerful electromagnetic surge, or a wave of energy, that knocked out streetlights in Hawaii more than 900 miles away. Now, scientists were aware that nuclear blasts could produce electrical disruptions since the 50s, but this event, known as Starfish Prime, made the threat of nuclear-induced EMPs way too serious to ignore. If the electronics inside America's nuclear ICBM arsenal, its silos, or its launch control facilities were vulnerable to this EMP effect, well, it could mean a Soviet first strike on American missile silos could disable America's ability to respond in kind. The following year, in 1963, the US and Soviet Union signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty, barring any further high-altitude nuclear test detonations. So, as Arrow and the Wall Street Journal reported, it was with this looming concern about EMP vulnerabilities in America's nuclear weapons that the Air Force began building and testing non-nuclear EMP generators that could produce a similar electromagnetic pulse that could be used to test, assess, and most importantly, to harden America's last resort. And when we're speaking in broad strokes like that, this narrative's pretty tight and tidy. I've got a long list of sources confirming that America began testing its nuclear apparatus for EMP vulnerabilities just as soon as they possibly could after Starfish Prime. And as the Wall Street Journal shows in its report, declassified documents today show that the Air Force really was building EMP generators to support these tests. Knowing that, you can pretty easily see how the journal's reporting found itself stuck between two potential positions. It could lean into the claims of its eyewitness on the record, the now 84-year-old Robert Salas, who is absolutely convinced that it was aliens that shut his nukes down, or into the well-researched, technologically dense, and entirely rational explanation provided by Arrow. Now, Occam's razor suggests that the explanation that calls for the fewest assumptions is usually right, and with that in mind, it makes a ton of sense that the journal's reporting would err on the side of Arrow's much more grounded explanation. In fact, I was just about convinced myself. But when you start looking past those broad strokes, down into the finer details of this perfectly reasonable explanation, it doesn't stay perfectly reasonable for very long. The Wall Street Journal's article includes excerpts from two Pentagon reports about EMP generators and testing to help substantiate their claims, though it does not name either report. So, after both ChatGPT and various reverse image searching of these excerpts produced absolutely no results, I started searching for the specific wording I could see in the images. And I found that our old friend John Greenwald from the Black Vault had already posted links to the reports I was looking for. So, thanks, John. As both volumes of these reports indicate, the EMP generator the Wall Street Journal references did absolutely exist. Just not in 1967 when Salas's account occurred. Instead, this system, dubbed TEMPS, short for Transportable Electromagnetic Pulse Simulator, was built by the Physics International Company in response to a request dated in 1971, or about 4 years after Salas's account took place. The report also highlights just how difficult it would be for the U.S. Air Force to carry out such a test without everyone around the affected facilities being very well aware of what was going on. The TEMP system was indeed built to be rapidly relocated and assembled on site, but it was also huge. It also noted that the maximum effective range of this system was roughly 150 feet, or around 50 meters. Now, the idea that the Air Force snuck out to nuclear launch facilities in Montana and assembled this massive array just 150 feet from the bunker without any of the guards noticing, or any other personnel noticing for that matter, is kinda silly. And again, this system didn't exist at all at the time of Salas's account. But to be clear, that isn't a smoking gun. Shechtman and Viswanathan do not claim that these diagrams are representative of the specific system used, so much as offering them up as contextual elements meant to help inform our understanding of these alleged tests. And I think it's entirely likely that we're just dealing with a topic that isn't easy to show on the screen, leaving journalists with limited options to depict what they mean. But to tell you the truth, this apparent inconsistency was enough to get the ball rolling on my own much deeper dive into what did happen to Salas back in 1967, what EMP technology existed at the time, and why I think this mystery just might stay a mystery, no matter the rational explanation we can come up with. And the first thing that you need to know is that Salas's experience was not an isolated one. That same year, at the same installation, a similar incident occurred at another launch facility, and a formal investigation was launched. The results of that investigation remained classified until July of 1995, but were not released to the public until, once again, our friend John Greenwald from the Black Vault submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for its release back in 2001. Now, according to this report, on March 16th, 1967, at around 8:45 a.m., 10 nuclear-armed ICBMs were all shut down nearly simultaneously without any apparent cause and with no effect on other nearby launch facilities. A special team comprised of personnel from the Ogden Air Material Area, the contractor responsible for weapons maintenance, Boeing, the 15th Air Force, and other related firms was formed and sent to the site to conduct an immediate investigation, with its personnel arriving over the span of the following 2 days. Now, that team's investigation very quickly found that the silos were indeed shut down, quote, as a result of external influence. But importantly, the report also directly engages and dismisses the possibility of unidentified flying objects being involved. The mobile strike team operating in the area of the affected launch facility was questioned, and every member reported no unusual objects in the sky. And this was further confirmed by radar data showing nothing anomalous over the area, sourced from the 801st Radar Squadron. But they also didn't report anyone seeing large experimental electromagnetic generators being erected over the facility either. Ultimately, this portion of the report concludes that, quote, the investigation teams at Malmstrom were unable to determine a logical cause for the incident. But that was far from the end. America was relying on these launch facilities to serve as a vital deterrent to nuclear war. So, if something was wrong with their systems, it needed a solution. So the team reconvened at Boeing's Seattle plant on April 4th of the same year to continue working toward recreating the incident and, as such, identifying how it occurred. After eliminating the possibility that irregular electrical flow or a failed transformer could have caused the shutdown, the team concluded that the most likely explanation was, quote, of the EMP or electrostatic nature. The report goes on to say that the Air Force Systems Command already had an active EMP testing program, and that it was recommended that the equipment be transferred out to Malmstrom Air Force Base for testing at the earliest possible date. Subsequent reports from later in the year show that EMP testing did indeed begin in April of 1967 to try to get to the bottom of what happened. But importantly, it also specifically states that equipment and facilities being tested were, quote, depostured and turned over to Boeing for EMP tests. Now, this is a really important point because, again, the idea that these teams would just set up an EMP generator and expose operational nuclear missile silos to unannounced tests with uncertain outcomes at the height of the Cold War is not all that believable to me. Now, with no clear conclusions drawn, EMP testing continued, with modifications being made to harden systems or wiring anytime a vulnerability was identified, but no apparent explanation for the Echo Flight incident, as it was called, was forthcoming. So, in November, the investigation team was joined by more members of the Air Force Special Weapons Command from Kirkland Air Force Base in New Mexico and the Sylvania Electric Company, with EMP testing continuing through mid-January of the following year. Now, Salas's account from March 24th was 8 days after that Echo Flight incident, and while the official reports do briefly mention other ICBM shutdown events, like one with Alpha Flight on December 19th of 1966, Oscar Flight, or the launch facility Salas was working in, was never mentioned among them, which seems like a pretty unusual omission. The report clearly states that part of the investigation process was looking into all similar incidents to look for anything that they had in common, and an event as dramatic as Salas's would certainly fit that bill. Now, Salas has gone on record about his incident more than once over the years, and usually with a fair bit more detail than was included by the journal. In a 2023 interview with the Calgary Herald, for instance, Salas recounts the guards telling him over the phone that the glowing orange object was not just floating above the facility, it was, quote, making unusual controlled maneuvers, such as flying very fast, coming to a dead stop, and then reversing course and making 90-degree turns. In a 2022 interview with the Daily Mail, Salas said that one of the guards actually approached the object and was injured by it. Though in that account, he actually says that only 6 to 8 nukes had gone inactive. Now, I want to be clear that I don't know Robert Salas, and I am in no position to question what he saw or what he experienced. But it has been 58 years since this incident, and he didn't start speaking out about it publicly until 1996, when he says his non-disclosure agreement expired. And the 29 or so years that Salas has been telling and retelling his story, it has varied a bit in its details. But my experience conducting interviews like these tells me that may not be a strong indicator that he's lying. There were no smartphones, text messages, Snapchats, or selfies to help commemorate the moment back then, leaving Salas with nothing but our genuinely fallible human recollection to draw from. And we know EMP testing was going on at the time. We know investigations into mysterious shutdowns were underway. We know there were already rumors swirling about unidentified flying objects in the weeks following the Echo Flight incident. And we know Salas believes aliens are trying to send humanity a message about nuclear weapons. With all that in mind, it becomes kind of reasonable to believe that Salas's recollection could potentially be colored a bit by conversations and experiences that he's had over the 6 decades since that event. But, and there is always a but, the DoD's reports also pretty clearly indicate, at least in my opinion, that whatever Salas did experience probably was not an EMP test, as the Wall Street Journal and Arrow posit. Now, first and foremost, it seems exceedingly unlikely to me that the Air Force would bring in a team of experts from all around the country to conduct a thorough investigation into the mystery surrounding what they knew to be their own secret EMP tests, especially when that testing was openly discussed in the investigation's own report. Likewise, while there have certainly been stories of extremely aggressive red teaming, or DoD teams tasked with carrying out attacks on American installations or infrastructure to identify and assess vulnerabilities, reports from the time and good old-fashioned common sense both would seem to indicate that these kinds of simulated attacks would all but certainly not be carried out against operational nuclear missile launch facilities standing by to bring about the end of the world with absolutely no forward notice. The risks involved would just be way too high, which is exactly why the Air Force's own report states that these facilities being tested were, quote, depostured and turned over to Boeing. But the biggest issue with Arrow's explanation for these events and the Wall Street Journal's subsequent report is the technological timeline. Now, I can say unequivocally that based on my sources, EMP testing was indeed taking place in 1967, and it was focused on hardening America's nuclear arsenal and launch facilities against a Soviet first strike. The problem is, nothing in the American inventory at the time that we know of could do the sorts of things Aero seems to suggest they did. After Starfish Prime in 1962, the Defense Special Weapons Agency, or DASA, began campaigning for EMP testing on America's nuclear weapons and launch facilities, with a particular focus placed on the guidance and communication systems housed inside the missiles themselves. With the limited test ban treaty of 1963 barring further high-altitude nuclear tests, the Air Force Weapons Lab in Albuquerque, New Mexico began trying to repurpose an electronics calibration system called ALECS, A-L-E-C-S, into something that could produce a similar electromagnetic pulse. And before long, they had a sizable system in place. And I do mean sizable. The overall length of the ALECS EMP simulator was more than 377 feet, or about 115 meters, with a 13-meter gap in the middle that you could place portions of an ICBM or other electronics in to subject them to an electromagnetic pulse. Now, this allowed for a great deal of testing and subsequent hardening of systems, including the electronics housed inside NORAD's Cheyenne Mountain Command Center in 1965, followed by the testing of Minuteman I and II missile subsystems between 1965 and 1967, and then silo-related testing starting in 1967. That all tracks with the timeline presented by Aero and the Wall Street Journal. But the problem is the size and type of the systems employed. That ALEC system was described in Pentagon reports as the, quote, workhorse EMP simulator used for Minuteman missile program hardening. But, as we've already noted, it was massive, stationary, and couldn't be used to expose an entire launch complex to an electromagnetic pulse. So, in 1967, work began on Ares, or the Advanced Research EMP Simulator, that would be even more powerful, and as such, could expose a larger area to an EMP sufficient for testing. Once complete, Ares was just shy of 292 feet long, about 189 meters, with massive 131-foot, roughly 40-meter plates that would be positioned above the facility being tested. While ALECS did the majority of component or subsystem testing, Ares was responsible for silo and launch facility testing starting in the early 1970s. And at around that same time, with design work commencing in the late 1960s, the US also developed that aforementioned portable EMP generator called TEMPS, or Transportable EMP Simulator. This is the system referenced in the Wall Street Journal report, and as we already pointed out, it didn't exist at the time of either Salas's account or the Echo flight incident. But even if it did, it wouldn't offer a very realistic explanation for either of these events. The apparatus was indeed built to be rapidly relocated and assembled on site, but it was also massive. The TEMPS device was made up of 3 subsystems: a pulse generator, a cylindrical antenna, and 60-foot support structures that held up huge 30-foot hoops. All of these EMP testing systems were conspicuous, to say the least, and the idea that armed guards would mistake one of these systems for a flying object performing unusual maneuvers is almost as silly as the idea that nobody would notice the teams of men it would take to build these systems right over your launch facility, not to mention the personnel required to operate it. Then, once the testing was complete, the Air Force would have had to clear out any evidence of their testing before the investigators that they sent to look into the event arrived just the following day. It just doesn't track. So, what do I think Robert Salas experienced? What do I think happened in the Echo flight incident and other similar incidents? And do I think the Wall Street Journal got their reporting wrong? Well, my answers are going to be disappointing. The challenge with looking into these events is not just that they happened some 60 years ago, but also that the subject matter was among the most heavily classified topics of its day. From the standpoint of the US Air Force, word getting out that America's nuclear missile silos could be rendered useless by a Soviet first strike was an unacceptable possibility. And that meant secrecy. Lots and lots of secrecy. And as a result, it's all but certain that today we don't have access to all of the programs, all of the systems, or all of the test results from this period of time. Some of it may still be classified. Some may not have ever even been written down in the first place. And some of it might just be lost to time, accounted for in bankers' boxes full of documents in a warehouse somewhere, maybe, but unlikely to ever surface in any meaningful way again. And while there are lots of criticisms leveled at Arrow, some that seem fair to me, and at the Wall Street Journal's reporting, some that doesn't seem quite as fair, I believe both of these groups drew their conclusions based on this understanding. They took reports of missile silos being shut down by unusual glowing objects and did exactly what I would do. They went looking for terrestrial explanations, and they found pretty extensive evidence of the US military building EMP generators and testing them against nuclear missiles in launch facilities at around that same time. And they drew what on its face seems to be a logical conclusion, that these tests and those sightings were probably related. The fact that this explanation does get a bit more brittle under scrutiny doesn't necessarily mean it isn't true. EMP systems, like those employed in hardening tests, don't just manifest overnight, they're developed over time, often through the creation and testing of a bunch of experimental systems and prototypes, any of which could potentially have been used in tests that are, to this day, still undisclosed. And if the journal had come out and said that it's possible Salas's experience was caused by the testing of a similar system to ones that we know later existed but today remains classified, well, I honestly think people would have been much more accepting of their conclusions. But because those conclusions were presented as facts with evidence that didn't entirely substantiate those claims, it just left a lot of room for speculation and criticism. But I don't think any of the conclusions drawn by Shechtman and Viswanathan were all that unreasonable at all. I want to be clear that I do not think Robert Salas is a liar, but I do think that he's an 84-year-old man with a story that's tough to nail down. And again, when left to choose between the likelihood that alien spacecraft turned off these missiles in their silos or the likelihood that the government was performing what I would consider to be unsafe and irresponsible testing of experimental EMP devices against operational missile silos, well, as unlikely as the latter may seem, it's still more likely than the former. At least, to me anyway. But in the end, I'm forced to leave you without a clear answer. Could aliens have really repeatedly shut down nuclear missile silos and launch facilities all throughout the 60s and 70s? Well, I guess anything is possible, but outside of eyewitness testimony, there's not much in the way of evidence to substantiate that claim. Could these events be explained away by secret EMP red teaming that took place a handful of years before the technology was mature enough for broader tests? Well, that does seem more possible to me, but to be clear, we don't have a smoking gun that tells us conclusively that that was the case either. And to be honest, I think it might stay that way forever. Either because some element of the claims made by Salas and others may be incorrect, or because the systems employed have been lost to time, or because the whole ordeal is still too classified or buried away somewhere to make the leap into our modern awareness. And what that all means is that you're going to have to decide for yourself which conclusion you think is most reasonable. And I'm just not in the business of doing that for you. So, with that ends this special edition of Air Power from Sandbox News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and now merch from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandbox News.